You think you're feeding them out of kindness, right? But honestly, your yard is running an invisible survival economy, and right now, without even knowing it, you might be the reason it's starting to fail. Nobody warns you about this when you buy your very first bag of seed, or when you just toss out the leftover crusts from breakfast without a second thought. It kind of feels like the simplest kindness there is, and for a while, it seems to work exactly the way you'd expect. More visitors, more birdsong, more life just humming around your windows every morning. Except something quieter is happening underneath that surface. This is the part people miss. Something most people never notice until it's already too late to trace back to where it started. Maybe you've noticed this too. It started with something small, a morning you almost didn't even register. The thrushes that always worked the fence line right at dawn weren't there. Neither were the wrens that usually cut through the hedge around the same time every day, like absolute clockwork, just silence. But not the peaceful kind, the kind of silence that feels held. You probably told yourself it was nothing. Birds move around, the weather changes. But here's the strange part. This wasn't just a gradual thinning out. It was sudden. A rhythm that had been running for months, maybe even years, just stopped. And in the wild, rhythms don't just stop for no reason. Something shifted before the silence ever arrived. Something you probably didn't even notice days or weeks ago. You stood at the window a little longer than usual that morning, your coffee going cold in your hand, just waiting for those familiar shapes to show up the way they always did. But they didn't, and the longer that empty fence line stretched on, the harder it got to just write it off as a coincidence. Think about this for a second. What if that empty space wasn't the start of the story, but the end of one you already caused without ever realizing you were even part of it? You've probably assumed, like most of us do, that putting out extra food is a simple, good thing. More seed, more scraps, more kindness. I mean, what harm could that possibly do? But here's the twist nobody warns you about. Food placed without real thought doesn't just feed. It relocates. It pulls these animals out of the slow, careful foraging patterns that have kept them alive for generations, and it funnels them directly toward a single exposed artificial point. And that point is your yard. To a hawk, a cat, or even a fast-moving car on the road nearby, a big cluster of birds in one predictable spot isn't charity. It's an invitation. Any well-meaning handful of seed or bread left out at the wrong time, in the wrong place, becomes a kind of beacon. It draws prey right out of the cover that used to keep them safe and puts them in a spot where they're suddenly incredibly easy to find. Just picture the difference. Think of a bird foraging quietly through scattered underbrush, half hidden the entire time, versus that same bird sitting completely exposed on an open tray in the middle of your lawn, visible from every direction for as long as the food lasts. One of those habits is backed by millions of years of survival instinct. The other is something you introduced without meaning to, the day you decided a feeder would look nice by your window. You never meant to build a trap, but that doesn't mean you haven't. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the trap isn't just the food itself, it's the entire environment you've built around it. Every fence, every hedge, every single feeding station you set up without much thought has quietly rewritten the territorial map right under your feet. Birds don't look at your yard as neutral ground. They see it as contested space in a naturally crowded pile of resources that multiple competing groups now have to fight over in an area way smaller than nature would ever allow. And that kind of crowding is the exact environment where disease thrives. When you pack that many birds onto a single feeding surface day after day, you've basically built a hazard zone instead of a sanctuary. You're just one sick visitor away from an outbreak that spreads through a population that would never have clustered this tightly without you there. You built the gathering point. You just never saw yourself as the one who designed it, but it doesn't stop there. Because the birds aren't just reacting fresh to your yard every single day, they're tracking it generation after generation the way a sailor tracks a coastline. Building a mental map of where resources reliably exist and where they don't. Here's what that means for you specifically. Your yard isn't logged in their memory as a stable habitat. Honestly, it's logged as unpredictable. A place where abundance can appear overnight and vanish just as fast, and the rules seem to change without warning. An environment that behaves that erratically doesn't get trusted the way a stable one does. It gets treated the way any smart creature treats an unreliable resource, approached cautiously, exploited quickly, and abandoned the moment something better or safer comes along. Multi-generational tracking, built over years, can be undone in a single, unpredictable season. And once that map breaks, it doesn't quietly rebuild itself. It gets rewritten from scratch, usually somewhere else, somewhere that behaves the way a reliable habitat should. And this is where it gets interesting because it changes everything about how you should think about your own habits. Because it was never only about the food. It's about you, your timing, the exact hour you tend to step outside, whether your movements are steady or erratic, and whether your presence near the feeder is predictable or chaotic. Every one of those details gets folded into an ongoing quiet hazard assessment that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with survival math. You are not simply a food source in their eyes. You are a variable being constantly measured, part of the same calculation that includes weather, predators, and shrinking cover. Even the sound of your footsteps on gravel, the creak of the same door at the same hour, the particular way your shadow falls across the lawn at sunrise, all of it becomes part of a running profile. This has nothing to do with whether you mean well and everything to do with whether your presence is predictable enough to plan around. Now think about this a little further, because the story doesn't stop at your yard's edge. When one species locks onto an artificial supply line you feeder, your scraps, your routine, it doesn't stay contained. It shifts the entire predator-prey balance around it. More prey in one place draws more predators to that place. Displaced competitors move to neighboring yards and territories, destabilizing arrangements that took years to settle. A single feeding habit repeated daily without much thought can ripple outward into a chain reaction across an entire block, one you never intended to start and will likely never see the full shape of. What began as a small kindness toward a handful of visiting birds can end up quietly reorganizing who eats, who hides, and who survives. 3 gardens down the street, in a yard you've never even seen. And here is the part people miss. You've spent this whole time imagining yourself as the benevolent figure at the center of it all, the caretaker, the protector, the one doing the birds a favor. But that was never quite true. You were never standing outside the system, generously reaching in. You were always inside it, an animated feature of the landscape itself, as consequential to the birds around you as a change in weather or a missing patch of cover. Every choice you make in that yard carries real weight, whether you intended it to or not. That's the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Kindness without understanding doesn't cancel out the harm. Sometimes it's the harm, just wearing a gentler face. The version of you that thought it was purely giving was, without knowing it, also taking something away. Stability, safety, the slow predictability that a wild population depends on far more than it depends on any single meal. So maybe the shift isn't actually about doing more. Honestly, maybe it's about doing less, but just doing it with real attention. Like feeding on a rhythm the local wildlife can actually learn to trust. Or spacing things out so a handful of visitors doesn't suddenly turn into 100. It's about watching your own timing, the same way you'd watch anything else that could easily mess up a fragile balance. No forced intervention, just quiet, respectful observation, and having the humility to admit that good intentions, well, they were never really the same thing as actually understanding. There's a kind of stewardship in just stepping back, in choosing consistency over abundance, and trusting that the smallest, most careful gesture usually does a lot more good than the biggest, most generous one. That's not a lesser form of care. Honestly, it might be the only form that actually works. So, here's a question that is probably worth sitting with tonight. What's that one habit in your yard, the one you've never even questioned, that might already be quietly reshaping the balance around you? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd really like to know what you think you might change.